She was just 14 when they locked the belt around her waist. No trial, no voice, no escape, only silence and iron. For 20 years she sat alone in a stone cell, untouched by sunlight, unseen by the world. Her crime, being chosen as a symbol of royal purity. This is not fiction. In medieval Europe, women were sealed into iron chastity belts, not to protect them, but to control them. Most were forgotten, but one girl survived. This is the true story of Elira, the first and the last to endure the cage made not for her safety, but for their pride. In the summer of 1390, in a small northern province of the kingdom of Vensmire, a young girl named Elira lived a quiet life among orchards, stone paths, and the clang of iron from her father's forge. Her father, Thomal the smith, had once served in the royal army and was granted a modest plot of land in reward. Their life was hard, but not unhappy. Elira was known for her quiet strength, a calm face, and hands that were no stranger to the rhythm of labor. She was 17 when the order came. The royal decree arrived without warning, delivered by a company of armored men on sweating black horses. They bore the seal of Prince Almar, heir to the throne, soon to be wed in a grand union of royal houses. The decree called for 3 maidens from the loyal provinces, chosen for their purity, to serve as vessels of honor during the ceremonial rituals of the prince's holy marriage. Their names would be recorded for posterity. Their virtue would be guarded, their bodies locked in iron. Elira was selected not by request, but by obligation. Her mother, now long dead, had been born of minor nobility. Her father, having once accepted land and coin from the crown, was now deemed indebted. Refusal was not permitted. Within hours of the proclamation, Elira was taken from her home and placed into a royal carriage bound for the capital. The journey to Vensmire Castle was long and silent. She was not alone. Another girl, younger, pale, and trembling, shared the ride. Neither spoke. The castle rose like a beast above the forest, its towers sharp and grey, casting long shadows on the road. Upon arrival, the girls were led deep into the castle's understructure, where the air grew colder and the walls narrowed into stone corridors. Each was placed in a separate chamber, small, bare, and dimly lit, where they would remain until the preparation. It was not long before the purpose of their confinement became clear. Elira's room was visited by a woman clad in grey robes, her face drawn and voice without emotion. This woman, known only as a matron of preservation, carried scrolls, oils, and instruments unfamiliar to Elira. She explained the ritual in clinical terms. Each girl would be fitted with a chastity device known as the Lock of Virtue, a forged iron belt designed to ensure the bearer's purity throughout the royal marriage ceremony. It was to be worn indefinitely, removed only upon special order of the court. There would be no key in the room, no release mechanism. The belt would be sealed, riveted shut, and marked by the crest of the prince. Elira learned that the belt was to be made specifically for her, fitted to her body like armor. A blacksmith from the royal guild, under order of the prince's court, had been commissioned to craft the device. She would be summoned for fitting and then returned to confinement. Afterward, she would be displayed briefly during the rituals as a living symbol of discipline and restraint. Then she would disappear again into history, perhaps, or into silence. There was no offer of choice, no recognition of her thoughts, her dignity, or her future. The state treated her not as a girl, but as a vessel, a container for an idea. She was to embody obedience through metal, She was to serve as a message to the world that the prince's marriage would be so pure, so sacred, that even strangers were bound in iron to prove it. The day of fitting came without warning. Elira was taken from her chamber, led through back corridors to a candlelit chamber where the belt lay waiting atop a velvet-lined table. It was heavier than it looked. An arc of polished steel, smooth and cold, with a narrow central ridge and hinged joints near the waist. Rivets gleamed at each end, and a hollow point at the lower abdomen was clearly designed to hold a bolt. There was no softness, no consideration for the human form beyond cold symmetry. Her arms were held at her sides as attendants fastened the belt into place. She did not struggle, she did not cry. The process was mechanical, impersonal, and final. When the last bolt was driven in, the room fell silent except for the echo of iron striking iron. The belt was sealed. The lock was closed, and Elira, now a vessel, was returned to her chamber. Alone, from that moment forward, every movement reminded her of the device. Sitting, standing, walking, each act became a negotiation with the metal that clung to her, like a second skeleton. The edges pressed into her skin, the weight dragged on her hips. Even her breathing seemed restricted, as if modesty itself were now a cage. She was expected to maintain herself in perfect silence. Food was delivered through a small slot in the wall. Waste was handled with humiliation. Cleansing rituals were enforced. Matrons returned daily to inspect the belt for damage or tampering, noting its condition in scrolls, as if the device were more human than the girl it imprisoned. Occasionally, she heard footsteps down the hall. Once, a voice murmured her name through the stone, but no one entered. No one spoke to her as a person. She became a title, the first vessel, not Elira, not daughter, not girl. In the cold months that followed, her body adapted. The pain became a constant hum rather than a scream. The weight of the belt shifted into the rhythm of her limbs. But the silence grew louder. Time unraveled without clocks. Dreams blurred into waking. Memory turned soft. She no longer thought of escape. She no longer thought of anything. Somewhere in the distance, bells rang for the prince's wedding. Songs were sung in the capital. Fireworks bloomed over towers. Elira heard none of it. She sat in a locked room, her hands folded, her body wrapped in steel. Her name forgotten, her purpose fulfilled, and though no one was there to hear it, one night she whispered into the dark, not in protest, but in truth. This is what it means to protect a man's honor, to surrender your own in silence. The days that followed the sealing of the belt no longer carried names. Elira no longer counted them, for there was no change between one and the next. The light that filtered through the small window in her chamber had ceased to mean morning or night. It was merely illumination, soft when the sky was overcast, sharp when the sun struck the stone at an angle. In time, even that became indistinct. Her body learned to exist in a state of stasis, adjusting to the rhythm of immobility, of silence, of waiting without purpose. The chastity belt became more than an object. It became a second skin, cold, unyielding, always present. In the first weeks, her hips ached beneath the weight. The skin along her thighs developed bruises, then calluses, then a strange dullness that felt like the absence of flesh. When she lay down, the iron plate pressed into her abdomen. When she tried to sit, the edges scraped against her spine. Even her breathing adjusted, shorter and shallower, to accommodate the metallic constraint at her waist. Her meals were delivered twice each day through a narrow wooden hatch. Always the same bland porridge and dry bread, served without a word. Her waste was handled in shameful silence, a system devised to minimize contact, dignity sacrificed in the name of purity. Water was cold, scarce, and rationed. There were no mirrors, no fabric beyond her coarse robe, and no contact beyond the matron who arrived once per week to inspect the integrity of the device. The inspections were methodical. The matron never acknowledged Elira's presence beyond the clinical act of checking for signs of tampering, rust, or misalignment. She wore gloves of goat leather and carried a long needle used to scrape between rivets for corrosion. She spoke only to the scroll she carried, recording the state of the belt, the smoothness of the bolts, the condition of the steel. Not once did she write of Elira's condition. The girl inside the cage was irrelevant. Only the cage mattered. As the months passed, Elira began to forget the world beyond her walls. The orchard behind her father's forge, the warmth of summer dust on her ankles, the rhythm of hammer-striking anvil, all of it faded into fragments. Her mind, once filled with songs and names and memories, now drifted through thoughts like smoke curling against stone. Dreams became more vivid than waking life. In them, she wandered open fields, free of the belt, barefoot and unbound. But when she woke, the steel remained tight and silent, and the weight of it crushed those visions back into the dark. Her body responded in ways the court had not considered. The belt, designed to suppress, began to rot the very flesh it protected. Sores formed where the metal rubbed bone. Infections bloomed in places no salve could reach. Her appetite diminished. Her skin grew pale and thin. Her hair, once full and braided by her own hands, now hung limp and matted in uneven strands. Her monthly cycles ceased altogether. Her body, like her name, had been erased. The ritualistic nature of her imprisonment became its own form of worship. Priests from the royal court occasionally descended to the lower halls to bless the vessel. They stood outside her chamber, chanting in ancient tongues, praising the virtue of restraint and the divine nature of feminine silence. Incense was burned through the grate in her door. Holy water was splashed onto the floor. But none of them entered. None of them looked into her eyes. Their worship was not for her. It was for the symbol she had become, a monument to control, to obedience, to the illusion of sanctity. There were whispers among the castle staff that one of the vessels had been dismissed. The younger girl who had arrived with Elira had vanished. Weeks ago, taken away in the middle of the night. Some said she had tried to remove the belt herself. Others claimed she had screamed for days before being dragged off in chains. Whatever the truth, no replacement was brought. Elira remained. Alone, with the passing of the seasons, her chamber became her body. The stone was her ribs. The iron belt was her spine. The window, too small to reach, became her eye to a world that no longer knew she existed. Dust gathered along the corners of her cot. Cobwebs formed in the upper reaches of the ceiling. The air grew stale in winter, thick and damp in summer. Mold crept into the wooden frame of the door. Time passed, not in days or weeks, but in the wear of stone beneath her feet. The silence she once feared became familiar, then comforting, then absolute. She no longer listened for footsteps. She no longer spoke, even to herself. Her voice withered from disuse. Her thoughts too narrowed into simple functions: hunger, pain, sleep, endure. Sometimes she forgot what had come before. She forgot her father's face. She forgot her own. Once, a thunderstorm struck the castle. Rain pounded the walls with a fury unlike any she had heard since her arrival. For a brief moment, she imagined it breaking the stone, flooding her chamber, washing the rust from her belt and the memory from her mind. But when the storm passed, all remained as it was, still, stagnant, forgotten. There were moments when the metal groaned, not from within, but from her own body reacting to it. The flesh beneath the belt began to twist, forming hard ridges and permanent indentations. Her movements became slower, careful, calculated to avoid sharp contact with the edges of the device, but the pain never ceased. It only changed shape. The body adapted, the mind fractured, and the soul retreated. In time, the inspections grew less frequent. The matron no longer visited every week, then only once a season. Eventually, new faces appeared, younger attendants, unfamiliar with the older customs, treating her presence as more curiosity than obligation. One even brought her food and crossed herself, whispering prayers not from reverence, but from fear. They no longer referred to her as a vessel. She had become something else, a relic, a warning. Elira, the girl, no longer existed in the court. Records her name had not been spoken aloud in years. The scrolls, kept by the matrons, referred only to Subject 1 or the first lock. She had become a legend, buried while alive, her existence both inconvenient and sacred. None dared remove the belt, for doing so would tarnish the symbol it had become. None dared release her, for her presence raised questions no one wanted to answer. Outside her chamber, the world moved on. The prince married. Wars were fought. Famines came and went. Kings died, were buried, replaced. Dynasties shifted. New banners flew above the towers. Generations passed. Elira remained, rusting, watching, enduring. Her mind, though battered, clung. Two fragments. A song her mother once sang. The weight of an apple in her palm. The color of river stones in autumn. These were not memories now. They were anchors. Tiny, flickering lights in a tunnel without end, and somewhere within the iron that held her, something remained that had not yet been broken. Not will, not rage, but awareness. A presence that endured long after its purpose had been forgotten. She did not scream. She did not beg. She existed, and that, perhaps, was the cruelest rebellion of all. By the time 2 full decades had passed, Elira was no longer a woman in the eyes of the world. She was a rumored dot few within the castle walls remembered when she had first arrived, and fewer still could say why she had ever been chosen. Records had faded or been deliberately buried under layers of ceremonial tradition. The chamber of the first vessel, as it was now known, became a place of silent avoidance. No guards were posted, no rites were conducted. It was simply there, a sealed stone door in a neglected corridor, behind which something or someone remained. Within that darkness, Elira still breathed. Her body had changed beyond recognition. Her frame had grown narrow, her joints stiff, her skin thin and almost translucent in the dim light. The chastity belt had become fused to her in places, the result of pressure, corrosion, and decades of friction against skin that could no longer resist. Patches of rust colored the metal's edge, like blood that had turned to iron. Beneath it, lesions came and went. Infections smoldered and healed without attention. The body's will to survive, though battered, endured. Movement had become deliberate. She no longer stood unless necessary. Her muscles, once strong from labor, had atrophied under stillness and starvation. When she moved, It was slow, precise, as though each step had to be calculated against the limits of the cage she wore. Even breathing had changed. Her lungs worked in shallow rhythm, conditioned by the pressure of the belt's unforgiving frame. Yet the most severe change had not occurred in her body, but in her mind. With no speech, no company, no new sounds or shapes for years, her inner world had begun to fracture. The silence no longer simply surrounded her. It pressed inward, filling the hollow spaces where thought had once lived. Memory blurred. Days and nights folded into each other like pages written in the same ink. She no longer recalled what her voice had sounded like, nor her mother's, nor the way trees moved in wind. Sensory memories, the rustle of skirts, the scent of apples, the warmth of fire, all had become muted imitations, more like rumors than recollections. And yet, in the vacuum of her existence, something else began to stir. Not madness, for Elira had already endured that and emerged on the other side, but a kind of clarity. In the absence of distraction, her mind sharpened in unexpected ways. She began to perceive patterns in the smallest changes, the length of candle shadows beyond the door, the distant tremor of boots in the floor, the exact moment a bird would land outside her window, even if she could no longer turn her neck to see it. Time, though meaningless in name, regained form, in rhythm, and through this she began to sense something unfamiliar, a disturbance beyond her cell, movement, activity, a shifting in the stillness that had for so long been unbroken. It began with footsteps, not the measured cadence of a matron or the echo of passing servants, but a different sound, lighter, uncertain, hesitant. Then came the voices, whispered, young, curious. She could not hear words, but the tone was unmistakable. Awe, fear, pity. The corridor beyond her door, long left to dust and rot, was being visited again. It took weeks for the pattern to emerge. The same pair of voices returned, always after dusk, never staying long. One voice was female, the other male. They did not knock, they did not enter, but Elira felt their presence like a ripple through old water. At first, she paid no attention. Then, slowly, she began to listen. They returned with increasing regularity. Once a week, then twice, then every night. Occasionally, a sound like parchment fluttered against the door. Once, a single drop of scented oil was poured through the air, slit lavender, faint and ancient. It startled her more than any noise. Had in years, then came the light. One evening, as the chamber lay in darkness, a thin beam of flickering gold cut through the edge of the door. A lantern held outside, uncertainly, like a question posed without words. The light lasted only a few moments, but in that time, Elira saw her own shadow cast against the wall, bent, gaunt, iron-bound, still human. The gesture struck something deep within her, not recognition, but the echo of it. She had forgotten what it felt like to be noticed, not revered, not inspected, not feared, just seen. A week later, the door creaked for the first time in nearly 10 years. It did not open fully, only enough for the edge of a boot to appear, followed by a soft metallic tray. On it sat a folded cloth, 2 small glass vials, and what appeared to be a wooden brush. Then, as quickly as it had come, the door closed again. Elira stared at the tray for hours before moving. When she finally reached it, she did so on trembling limbs. Her fingers, stiff and gnarled, could barely close around the vials. They contained herbal oil and a thin, colorless salve. The brush was for skin, gentle, round-tipped, the kind used in healing. It was not an accident. She applied the salve in slow motions. The skin beneath the belt hissed at the touch, not from pain, but from memory. Her body had forgotten softness. That night, for the first time in decades, she wept, not from sorrow, not from relief, simply because she could. The visits continued, always without a face. The trays carried more supplies, linen strips, warm bread, a sliver of boiled egg, a small candle wrapped in cloth. Her health began, slowly, to improve. Sores faded. Her breathing deepened. The rust no longer spread unchecked. But no one spoke to her. No voice addressed her directly. The hands that helped remained invisible, and yet something in her shifted. She began to remember herself, not as a symbol, not as a subject, but as a person, a woman, once young, once free, once filled with thoughts that had nothing to do with silence. Outside, the kingdom had changed. Elira did not know it, but Vensmire had fallen into civil unrest after the death of Prince Almar's heir. The royal line had fractured. A council now ruled in his place, a mix of clergy, nobles, and foreign-born allies. Old laws were being questioned. Forgotten chambers were being reopened. Among the changes came an unlikely visitor. One evening, long after the soft trays had become routine, a new light appeared outside her door. Brighter, steadier. A formal torch, the kind used by palace officials. Accompanying it was the sound of deliberate motion, keys, the scrape of parchment, boots polished and careful. Then the door opened, not fully, only a hand's width, but enough for Elira to see the silhouette of a young woman standing in the hall. She was robed in the garments of a medical order, bearing a sigil Elira did not recognize. Her face remained hidden in shadow, but her tone, though quiet, was sure. She did not speak to Elira. She spoke into the room, not expecting a reply. She announced that the kingdom was under new stewardship, that old customs were being re-examined, that records had revealed the existence of a forgotten ritual chamber with one occupant, that the occupant, though legally considered property of the crown, had been deemed a victim of unlawful rites, that her release had been ordered by decree. The words meant little at first. They landed like dust on stone, but they did not vanish. That same night, 3 more officials entered the hall, carrying sealed tools, papers, and a case of surgical instruments. A blacksmith arrived an hour later, not to bolt, but to unfasten. They entered the chamber at dawn, for the first time in over 20 years. Elira saw faces not shrouded in robes or hidden behind ritual, and for the first time in even longer. Someone looked her in the eye. They did not speak. They did not touch her without warning. Everything was slow, gentle, meticulous. The process of removing the belt took over 4 hours. The bolts had rusted shut. Parts of the device had to be sawed in place, others softened with oil and heat. Flesh had grown around some hinges. The metal had to be lifted piece by piece, revealing skin that had not felt air in 2 decades. No one spoke during the removal. Only the sound of breath, tools, and quiet weeping from one of the assistants filled the room. When the final lock broke, the belt slid away with a weightless finality. It was placed in a cloth and sealed in a box. No one said what would be done. With it, Elira was not asked to stand. She was wrapped in clean cloth, her body examined, treated, and lifted into a wheeled cot. Her chamber, once so thick with memory and decay, was left empty for the first time in 20 years. Outside, the sun had risen. It touched her skin like fire, not burning, but waking. Her eyes closed, unable to adjust. She was carried through the castle without ceremony. Some turned to look, some turned away, but the world no longer ignored her. She had returned, or perhaps she had survived. Freedom did not feel like lightness. When the belt was removed, Elira's body did not rise in relief, nor did her mind rush into celebration. What had once been imagined as liberation felt instead like exposure, raw, unshielded, and strange. The absence of weight did not bring ease. It brought vertigo. She was placed in a recovery ward beneath the Abbey of Montfleur, a quiet sanctuary built into the southern cliffs far from the royal court. The nuns who tended to her belonged to a small, nun-ordained order of women known as the Handmaids of Restoration. They did not speak unless spoken to. Their care was precise and gentle, shaped by long experience in tending to the broken Elira. Chamber overlooked a distant coastline. She did not see it for many weeks. Her body required near-constant treatment. The skin beneath the belt had grown thin, almost translucent in places, and infections had scarred the underlying tissue. Muscles along her abdomen and hips had wasted away. Her posture had long since adapted to the unnatural shape of the device, curving inward at the waist and pulling her spine out of alignment. She could not walk. Her first months were spent lying, still, propped on soft bedding, limbs positioned by silent hands. Bandages were changed daily. Oils and salves were applied with care. She was bathed with cloth and warm water, never fully uncovered. She was never asked to speak, never pressed to answer questions. The silence that had once imprisoned her was now respected as boundary. In time, her body began to accept care. Wounds closed, scar tissue flattened. Her weight returned slowly. The stiffness in her hands receded. Her legs, though frail, no longer trembled beneath a sheet. One day she asked to sit. Another day she asked to see the sea. The nuns complied. Without question, they wheeled her to the high balcony above the cliffs. It was dusk. The sky was pale violet, and the ocean glowed gold where the sun kissed its surface. The wind carried the scent of salt and pine. She did not cry, she did not smile. She simply looked. Memory did not return in sequence. It arrived like fragments from broken glass, sudden, sharp, and scattered. The sound of her father's hammer, the feel of bark under her fingertips, the way a horse's flank rose and fell with its breath. She remembered faces but not names, voices but not words. She did not remember her age, nor how long she had been gone. The world she once lived in felt like a story she had overheard, not one she had lived. One day, a scribe from the abbey arrived with a sealed scroll. It was not addressed to Elira, for she had no surname on record. It was a royal document, marked with the seal of the new council, confirming the revocation of the vessel ordinance and the dissolution of all related rights. Enclosed was a copy of the report filed under her chamber number, listing her as subject. 1. Status: alive. Condition: releasable. Identity: unverified. The document recognized her existence, but not her name. She read it once, then turned it over and wrote in the margin, with a borrowed quill, "I was not subject, I was witness." She signed it only Elira. The document was never returned. The scribe folded it silently and left without a word. Her physical recovery took 2 full years. During that time, she learned to stand again, first with crutches, then with a cane, then without. Her body would never fully recover. Her gait remained slow, uneven. Her spine curved slightly forward. She could not run, nor ride, nor lift heavy objects. But she could walk into sunlight. She could open her own door. She could breathe without iron pressing down on her ribs. The more difficult task was learning to live as a person. She no longer knew how to begin conversation. When spoken to, she struggled to reply, not from confusion, but from a deep-rooted caution that made speech feel like risk. Her voice had changed, rougher, quieter. Her ears had adapted to silence and found the world too loud. The abbey provided work when she requested it. She tended the herb garden. She cleaned ink brushes for the scribes. She sat with dying women. In their final hours, offering not prayer but presence. No one asked her for stories. No one questioned her scars. She was treated not as fragile, but as whole in her own way. And yet, there remained something locked inside her. Not a secret, but a kind of shape left behind in the body's memory. A sense that she was still being carried by others, still unable to fully exist without being contained. The belt, though gone, had left its mold within her. It haunted her not with pain, but with posture. The way her arms hung, the way her breath shortened when afraid, the way her legs remained slightly apart when she sat. As though still braced for iron. She did not resent her caretakers. But she no longer trusted the world to define her. The first time she heard her name spoken by another voice, it startled her. A young archivist at the abbey had been cataloguing recovered court records from the late Vensmeyer dynasty. Among them, he found an incomplete list of the original vessels of honor, with only one name partially legible. Elira, it read. He brought it to her out of curiosity. She read it in silence. Then she folded it and placed it beside her bed. It was not proof of identity. It was not vindication. But it was a mark evidence that she had not dreamed it all, that her story had, at some point, been real to others. And that realization brought with it a dangerous question. What now? Elira lived in Montfleur for another 3 years. She did not age visibly. The years of starvation and stillness had slowed her body's rhythm, preserving a strange timelessness in her appearance. But her eyes, once sharp and blue, had grown stormy. She rarely laughed. She rarely cried. She simply endured as she always had. Visitors came from time to time, scholars, healers, nobles, sympathetic to reform, wishing to hear the story of the belt. She did not tell them. She never spoke of the chamber, of the years locked in metal, of the rituals or the rot. She refused to become a relic for their curiosity. Instead, she told them about the orchard, about the day the branch fell, and how the bark peeled away in strips, about how the birds waited until the very moment she turned her back before stealing her father's fruit, about the sun on the forge roof, how it made the dust glow. She told them nothing of pain, only memory, and still they listened. In time, the abbey began to change. A generation of younger sisters began training as healers and scribes. Some asked Elira to teach them how to listen without words. Others learned to measure time by her rituals. The way she stood each morning facing the sea, her fingers folded. Behind her back, her eyes tracing the horizon. She became known not as the vessel, but as the watcher. She had once been locked away to guard a man's honor. Now, she stood freely to guard silence, not the enforced silence of chains, but the chosen silence of those who had endured beyond what words could hold. By the 10th year of her freedom, Elira had written nothing of her story. Instead, she carved lines into stone, not names, not prayers, just marks, rows of vertical lines in a pattern known only to her. She placed them on the edge of the cliff, hidden beneath vines and stone, where wind could reach but few eyes would ever find them. Each line was a memory. Each gap was something lost. Each stone was a chapter she chose not to tell. Her belt, once sealed in a royal archive, was eventually relocated to a vault far from public view. A single record in the abbey described it only as instrument of the Vensmire rite. Status decommissioned. Elira never asked where it had gone. It no longer mattered. She had never been a belt. She had never been a vessel. She had been a witness to cruelty, to silence, and finally to herself. Long after Elira's feet stopped touching the ground, the path she once walked remained. She was never buried in a royal tomb. No statues were carved. No song was written to remember her name. Yet her presence lingered, not in history books or court records, but in subtler ways, in gestures, in rituals, in the quiet choices of women who had never met her. She lived out her final years in the hills above Montfleur, in a small stone dwelling given to her by the abbey. It had one window facing the sea, and a vine-covered wall where she etched her silent script. She grew herbs, fed birds, and walked the cliffs at dawn. Her hair turned silver, her posture remained bowed, and her voice grew faint. But her eyes, until the very end, held depth, like still water hiding immeasurable weight. No one knew the exact day she died. A nun came to deliver her bread, and found the door open, the bedding neatly folded, the room empty. Her walking stick rested against the stone bench outside. Her sandals remained by the path. No body was ever found. Some said she had walked into the sea. Others believed she had simply sat beneath the cliffs and become part of the stone. But most said nothing. They honored her absence with silence, just as she had lived. The nuns placed no marker over her home, but they preserved it untouched. And every midsummer morning, before the first bell, one of them would stand at her bench, hands folded behind her back, facing the sea, a gesture that needed no explanation. The world moved on. Years turned to decades. Kingdoms fell. Maps changed. The story of the vessels of honor was relegated to obscure legal scrolls, buried in disused archives. Few scholars sought them out. Fewer still cared to understand them, but fragments endured. In the early spring of 1472, a reformist historian named Serin Dalvin uncovered a sealed scroll in the royal chamber of records, brittle, water-stained, and unindented. It contained accounts of the original Vensmire chastity rite, blueprints for iron belts, court orders of confinement, and inspection logs signed by matrons of preservation. Among them was a page marked only with the notation, Subject 1, Integrity. Of seal confirmed, no communication. Alive, no name. No fate. Dalvin was not a woman easily deterred. She traced the records to the ruins of Montfleur Abbey, now a half-abandoned hill settlement. There, in the cliffs above, she discovered Elira's dwelling, overgrown with moss and silence. The stone carvings on the back wall remained intact, 5 rows of marks, grouped and spaced with mathematical precision. Dalvin copied them into her notes. She never published the carvings. She called them sacred. Instead, she wrote a monograph, titled Iron and Silence, The Untold Rites of Vensmire. It was banned by the crown within 2 years. But before it disappeared, it spread in quiet corners, passed hand to hand by scribes, healers, and convent scholars. Not for scandal, but for sorrow. It told of a girl erased into duty, locked away not for justice, but for theatre. a girl who had survived where others had not. For a time, her name returned to paper. Elira, first vessel. Then simply Elira, the witness, eventually only the witness. Centuries passed, Elira's story slipped between fact and fable. Some painted her as a martyr, others called her myth. Plays were written, all inaccurate. In one, she was rescued by a knight. In another, she led a rebellion after her escape. But none could capture the weight of what she had truly endured. The slow, quiet erasure of identity, without violence, and the radical endurance of simply existing through it. One truth did remain among circles of women healers, midwives, and orphan mothers. A silent ritual began to emerge, a moment at the start of each season where hands would rest, heads would lower, and nothing would be said, only held. The ritual had no name, no origin, only one rule, for the women who were never asked. In time, it became known as the witness pause. It was practiced in homes, in fields, in schools for girls. It passed down without language. Grandmothers taught it by gesture. Daughters carried it without knowing why. A simple silence held in memory of someone they'd never met. And that was how Elira returned, not in stone, nor sermon, but in stillness. In the modern era, the remains of her belt were rediscovered in a museum vault, mislabeled as ceremonial restraint device, origin unknown. It had oxidized beyond recognition, its rivets fused shut. The curve of it told no story. No one recognized the name etched faintly inside the waistband. EL, but somewhere, in a coastal monastery where the wind still sang through old stone, a girl learning to write her first letters paused between strokes, and in the silence that followed, folded her hands behind her back, facing the sea. In the centuries since Elira's time, the world has changed, and so, too, has the place of women within it. No longer bound by iron belts or locked in stone chambers, women today walk in open streets, write their names in public ledgers, cast their votes, raise their voices. The laws that once turned their bodies into symbols have, in many places, been dismantled. The rituals of purity, silence, and obedience have lost much of their hold, and yet echoes remain, not in iron or rivets, but in quieter forms, in expectations, in judgment, in the invisible cages of shame, image, and fear. The belt may be gone, but the weight of control can still cling to flesh, to thought, to freedom. Elira's story is not just about one girl in one forgotten chamber. It is about what happens when a woman's worth is measured by silence, when her suffering becomes tradition, when her voice is treated as threat. But it is also about survival, because even in the darkest room, locked in metal and abandoned by time, she endured, not to be worshipped, not to be rescued, but to exist. And in doing so, she bore witness to a truth history often tries to bury, that silence can break, that survival can speak, that no woman in any age is ever truly forgotten. When one remembers, we carry forward not just the chains that once held women back, but the strength with which they broke them.